The concept and identity of Nigeria is not even 100 years old. Quite frankly, it's a country that shouldn't even exist.
What do you mean by that?
I've been to Nigeria like 10 times now over the last decade, and aside from everyone thinking I'm an Igbo man, I'm always fascinated with the history of pre-colonial and post-colonial Nigeria. So when I say there should be no Nigerians, it's not because the people weren't real, not because cultures weren't rich, but because the borders were drawn by white men from Europe who had never set foot on the land, sitting in a boardroom in Berlin in 1884, dividing up the entire continent like it was unclaimed property. Lines were drawn through ancestral tribal lands, warring kingdoms and tribes, and enemies who all of a sudden had to become Nigerian. What does that even mean when these people have existed here for tens of thousands of years? What happened when those artificial borders finally cracked? That's when you get the Biafra War, one of the deadliest conflicts in modern post-colonial Africa history, and almost nobody in the West talks about it. Before Britain showed up, there was no Nigeria. What existed was the Sokoto Caliphate, a powerful Muslim empire in the north with its own laws, its own governance, its own centuries of history. There were the Yoruba kingdoms in the southwest, the Oyo, Benin, and Ife city-states, sophisticated with trade networks and royal courts, and in the southeast, the Igbo people. Decentralized, governed through community assemblies and elder councils, a system that worked for them for generations. These were not primitive societies waiting to be organized. These were distinct civilizations with distinct ways of life, and they had complicated, sometimes tense relationships with each other, just like any neighboring peoples throughout human history. Then Britain decided they all belonged together. In 1884, European powers sat down at the Berlin Conference and carved up Africa amongst themselves. No African sat at that table, not one. They drew straight lines across kingdoms, across ethnic territories, across sacred lands, not based on who lived there at the time, but based on who could claim what without going to war with each other in Europe. Complete disregard for the people on the ground. It was European rivalry management. Africa was the prize. African people were not consulted. Britain walked away with what they called the Niger Coast. And in 1914, a British colonial administrator named Frederick Lugard merged the northern and southern protectorates into one territory. His partner gave it a name, Nigeria, pulled straight from the Niger River. That was it. That was the birth of a nation. An administrator's decision. No vote, no consent, no regard for hundreds of ethnic groups now forced to share a flag. But Britain didn't just draw the lines. They made sure those divisions would last. In the South, Christian missionaries built schools. Western education spread. In the north, Britain respected the Sokoto Caliphate's resistance to missionary influence. So they left the north largely without Western education infrastructure. By the time independence came in 1960, you had a country where the north and south had been developed at completely different rates by design. And then Britain handed power over and said, good luck, you're a democracy now. What they actually handed over was a power keg. The explosion came in 1966. A military coup, led by mostly Igbo officers, overthrew the government and killed several northern leaders. The North retaliated, a counter coup, and then something that can only be called a pogrom. 30,000 Igbo civilians living in the North were massacred. 30,000 people killed because of their ethnicity, because the group they belonged to inside borders they never chose. 1 million Igbo fled back to Eastern region, and their military governor, Odumegwu Ojukwu, looked at what had happened. The massacres, the displacement, the clear signal that Igbo lives did not matter inside this forced union. And in May 1967, he declared independence, the Republic of Biafra. Nigeria went to war to hold the country together, and Britain backed Nigeria. Not out of principle, not out of commitment to peace. The eastern region, Biafra, was sitting on top of massive oil reserves. Shell BP was already operating there. A Biafran secession meant losing access to that oil, so Britain supplied weapons, Britain supplied diplomatic cover, Britain helped maintain the blockade that strangled Biafra's supply lines. And when food stopped getting in, when medicine stopped getting in, children started dying. Not from bullets, from starvation. Images of skeletal Biafran children started appearing on television screens around the world, and people were horrified. Estimates of civilian deaths from starvation alone range from 500,000 to 2 million people. 2 million people in a war that started because Europeans drew lines on the map. Biafra surrendered in January 1970. The Nigerian government declared no victor, no vanquish, but Igbo returned to find their property seized, their bank accounts reduced to 20 pounds, regardless of what they had saved. Decades of economic marginalization followed, and their grievances never went away. Organizations fighting for Biafran independence still exist today. Because the wound that was opened in 1884 in a conference room in Berlin that was never actually closed, it was just covered up and called a country. What colonialism actually looks like in practice. It's not just stealing of resources, it's the stealing of the right to self-determination. It's forcing incompatible histories into a single passport and calling the explosion that follows an African problem. Nigeria's civil war was not inevitable, it was manufactured by borders drawn without consent, by a colonial administration that deepened ethnic divisions to maintain control, and by Western powers that chose oil over human lives when it mattered most. The people of the Sokoto Caliphate, the Yoruba kingdoms, the Igbo communities, they deserved the right to determine their own futures. That right was taken from them in 1884, and millions of people paid for that theft with their lives. It's almost unfathomable to think about what Africa would look like if they were able to determine their own country lines and what the borders would look like. And this is not unique to Africa. This happened in that year, right? That's the year all these country lines were drawn by Europeans, and the omission of a Kurdistan in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and the Kurds fighting currently today. The Kurds are made to be villains, but the Kurds weren't given a country, and now they're fighting for one. But yeah, the more you know.